in the Western mindset, which is very often true, that after every downturn comes an upswing. And it was seen almost as a law of nature, right? It's up, down, up, down. But what if we are currently in a situation where the conditions are aligning in a way that there is no guarantee that another upswing is going to come, right? You mentioned demographics. We have the culture wars in Europe becoming more and more along religious lines. I mean, this is going on. The parallel societies and the growing influence of Islam on daily politics can no longer be denied. I mean, we can go through all the stories of schools where teachers say, well, even non-Muslim teachers should wear headscarves because otherwise. So there's plenty of that to talk about. So the question is, will we move from having societies into a condition where it's all going to be parallel societies, and all these parallel societies will be managed by an overarching, ever more powerful state that, however, is ever harder to finance? So this is the big problem, I think, we have. I mean, this is somebody.
That was perfectly encapsulated. That is exactly how I see the problem.
We no longer know what our culture actually is. What are you supposed to integrate into? And this is, for me, always the unanswered question from liberalism. It's an interesting principle as a theory, but what is the essence of being a liberal, right? People say, wait, live and let live, and my liberty ends where somebody else's liberty starts. But that's not enough of a formula I believe you can structure your life around. A religion gives you, I think, much clearer guidelines of how to live your life. What are the things that you believe in? And the ultimate fact still is that as human beings, we are not entirely individualistic. We are groupish, right? The tribal instinct is still there. So what's the liberal tribe? I think there is a liberal tribe, but it doesn't admit that it is a tribe.
I think that should give us courage, exposure to other people's perspectives.
It's moving us in a good direction.
Dr. Ralph Schoellhammer, head of the Center of Applied History at MCC. Give us a tour of the world.
Well, thanks, Peter, so much for having me. And I'll try not to bore you with some platitudes like the world is changing, because you hear this all the time. So let me begin with a few changes that really take place that I hope to also kind of blow the mind of your viewers and your listeners. Let's start in Africa for a change. I think that's a continent everybody seems to ignore, but there are lots of changes going on there. My favorite example is always if you look at Nigeria, right? In the early 20th century, Nigeria had about half the population than the United Kingdom. By the 1960s, Nigeria had about the same population as the United Kingdom. In 2030, most likely Nigeria will have as many inhabitants as the entire European Union. So there you can see that the world is changing by the simple fact, but where are the people? And there's this famous saying that the future belongs to those who show up for it. And I think that's a quite important element that we have to talk about. Another thing that you hear very often in the media these days is the Middle East, right? The United States foreign policy, the Middle East is very important because of oil, of resources, and all these kind of things. And that has been true until, I would say, the early 2000s. But it no longer is, because almost unbeknownst to the public for ideological reasons, and I'm sure we're going to dive into this a little bit in this conversation as well, it has been entirely ignored that the United States are now energy independent. From a pure energy perspective, the United States no longer need the Middle East. So a lot of the conversations about, how OPEC, for example, is such an important institution. OPEC, I mean, they will still have their meetings in Vienna, right? They will still get together on a yearly basis, but their influence will diminish significantly. We see massive changes currently happening in South and Latin America, right? Argentina is charting a completely new course that is bringing them back economically and socially on a course that they had up until the 1930s, 1940s. Again, another historical tidbit that maybe many of your viewers know but in the 1930s, Argentina was as rich as Switzerland. Right? It was only in the 40s and 50s when they had these Marxist ideas trying to become a completely autark economy, right, entirely independent from the rest of the world, that took them down this primrose path of economic decline. But they tried to reverse this. We see massive changes, of course, in Europe going on. Right? We have Western Europe, which is both in economic and demographic decline, but simultaneously already has, for lack of a better term, a follow-up population in place, which is especially the massive migration from the Muslim parts of the world. And then you have Central and Eastern Europe, like where we are here at the moment in Hungary, right, that has also significant demographic problems, but they don't have the issues with migration. So there's also a divide going on there. Another element that we see happening is that as the power of the West is declining relatively, right, you have the rise, what just happened a couple of days ago with the meeting of the so-called BRICS states, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But what is very often misunderstood is, and this shows you a little bit that as human beings, we tend to look towards the future, by extrapolating from the past. So we look at our own past experiences and then assume that others will react in similar ways as things move forward. So you very often see these comparisons and say, okay, you have NATO on the one hand, you have the United States, the European Union on the one side, and then you have BRICS on the other side. But if you take a closer look at what BRICS actually is, the aspiration of the members of BRICS is not to become an alliance like NATO or to become an economic union like the European Union. What they are trying to do is to get together and reestablish the nation state as kind of the highest form of organization. So what they are doing is they try to get together, but not to give up sovereignty, which is what, for example, is happening in the European Union. Like the European Union was designed in a way that France, Germany, Austria, Spain, that they give up parts of their sovereignty and hand it over to supranational institutions. If you look at what the BRICS are trying to do is they want to reestablish the nation state really as the main focus of international politics. So it's a unity of countries or a union of countries, if you want, that go together to reinforce the fact that they are not part of a larger institutional framework.
So, okay, so we need to get to China and Russia still, but my understanding of BRICS was that it was to act as a bulwark against Western hegemony, and it was to unify people against the West specifically. Is that not correct?
I don't think that's correct. I think what they want to do, it's partially correct. When we use the term Western hegemony, right, what do we mean by this? Now, if you look at a country like China or a country like India specifically, one thing that they do have issues with is what we probably could describe as cultural hegemony, right? They're not very happy with, let's call it a somewhat imperial form of liberalism. But if you look the way in which they behave in the realm of economics, in the way in which they behave when it comes, let's say, to military cooperation. India has no problem with the United States or the United Kingdom. India has no problem with Europe. On the contrary, right, India is actually quite active in forming alliances, forming bilateral relations.
They just did so with China.
Precisely. Well, we'll see about that. I think this is.
Or they agreed to.
They announced an agreement, but the BRICS meeting as it happened, of course, was particularly important for Russia that they needed a PR win.
Correct.
But if you go and look deeper at the tensions between India and China, right, a lot of this is about water resources in the Himalayan. And that will remain a problem for the future. So, for example, they said they're going to set this issue aside, but none of them has said we're also going to reduce troop strength in these areas. So a lot of this is rhetoric. I'm not sure if it's going to be really followed necessarily by policy. But of course, you're correct, right? The idea, once again, is to present this idea of an alternative, but the purpose of this alternative is not to create a new alliance. The purpose is to say nation states have national interests, India has national interests, China has national interests, and that these national interests are the superior guide star, if you want, for their foreign policy.
And is that why they want an alternative to the SWIFT codes?
The reason here is, and that's again very understandable, is that they want to shield their economies from potential pressure or sanctions from the US, particularly the Europeans don't really play a role in this. But exactly as you say, the intention behind this is not the some claim that they want to replace the dollar as the dominant currency. They just want to shield themselves from the outsized influence the United States have because of the power of the dollar. But once again, that is designed to protect their own sovereignty. It is a very...
It's interesting.
It's a very absurd thing to say, I would argue. And I don't know, it is in the West, or let's put it differently, there is a significant number of commentators, of intellectuals in the West who find this idea of a kind of a counter-alliance to the West very intriguing. And there are some elements to this, I'm not denying this. But one has to keep in mind that both the Chinese, the Russians, and as a third party, the Indians, they jealously guard everything that has significant influence on their domestic policies, on their national authority. So the idea, a hypothetical example, that India would hand over control over its monetary policy to China or to an institution that would be dominated by China in the way the Europeans have handed over the member states of the Eurozone have handed over their monetary authority to the European Central Bank, in which Germany and France are dominating. This is simply not going to happen.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but it would seem to me that one of the reasons it's not going to happen is because the Chinese currency is not traded publicly. It's not traded. It's not subject to market mechanisms. And so why would India ever want to? I mean, the only way, what would the upside to that be? I guess it would be to shield against, It wouldn't even be to shield against inflationary pressures or deficits. I mean, what would the thinking be for why one would want to do that?
That's the thing. The Chinese don't want to do this.
Well, precisely.
Exactly. So this is they understand the, let's call it, PR effectiveness of this. They know it's kind of part of their diplomatic toolbox, but shifting towards replacing the dollar would come at significant cost for the Chinese. It also does come at significant cost for the United States. Being the global reserve currency is comes with a burden. Like, for example, the economist Michael Pettis has written wonderfully about this, says that the opening up of the U.S. economy, of U.S. capital accounts, and making the dollar into what it is today, of course, made it much easier also to shift capital around the globe, which meant that very often capital was leaving the United States and very often created precisely the condition that were harming the American working class. And this is not something the Chinese have any interest in repeating.
Okay, so I want to continue our tour around the world. Correct me if I'm wrong. The Chinese are getting rid of the dollar. The Europeans have gotten rid of the dollar to a lesser extent. What do you think is the future of the dollar? And we should also talk at some point about petrodollars.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you would ask me now, so I think we have to distinguish between there are things that are unavoidable, but that does not mean that they're imminent. So will the end of the dollar happen one day? Absolutely, right? We saw this with all other currencies in human history. Is it going to happen in the next 5, 10, 15 years? I highly doubt it. So really? I think all of us in this room, when we die, which is hopefully very, very, very far in the future, the dollar will still be the dominant currency.
Would you be willing to enter into a bet with me for a really nice dinner?
Absolutely.
Would you be willing to enter into a bet with me that the end of the dollar will not come before 15 years? Because I think it will.
I like the terms of the bet. I'm happy to enter it. Yes.
And not like McDonald's or Taco Bell. I'm talking like an actual super nice dinner.
Listen. If McDonald's is good enough for the American president to work there, I think it must be good enough for Peter Boghossian to get a dinner there.
Okay, fair enough. All right, so let's continue our tour around the world. So give us a little more about China, Russia, Taiwan, the Indo-Pacific. Let's go there. Japan, South Korea.
Well, I think one of the most important things, and I think also one of the most interesting things is, if we forget politics for a second and just look at the structural conditions you can find in different places in the world. Yeah. Now, the United States, for better or worse, and that's the luck of the United States, is you can have probably the most incompetent politicians in the world, and some would claim that the United States has that kind of politicians.
I'd be one of those people.
Well, I would give them a little bit more. As somebody who lives in Europe, I would say we're coming either first or a close second when it comes to this. But the United States have been blessed by God, by nature, by coincidence, whatever you want to call it, with structural conditions that are simply unmatched by most other countries on the globe. The United States are independent in food production. The United States are independent in energy production, and the United States have more or less two friendly neighbors to the north and the south, and one ocean to the east and one ocean to the west. So these are conditions that make it very easy for them to be shielded from, let's say, some of the more negative things that go on in the world. The Chinese don't have that advantage. The Chinese are an energy importer. They are not independent in energy.
Correct.
The Chinese are a food importer. They are not independent in food. So that's a huge problem for them. When people talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is
we should talk about that.
Which is an interesting initiative. But if you take a closer look, what the Belt and Road Initiative is trying to accomplish is to replicate the conditions the United States have naturally. Right? The United States, at the time of speaking right now, they don't need a Belt and Road Initiative because everything the Chinese try to secure with that initiative, the United States already have at home. That is a massive advantage. And to give you another example, there is very often, justifiably so, talk about that the Chinese Navy is now larger than the American Navy. That is correct if you count the ships. But what is important to mention is that the Chinese Navy is a green water navy. The American Navy is a blue water navy. Like, there is no other country that has an aircraft carrier strike group in the way the United States have them. And to this very day, I know the Chinese are trying, the Russians have been trying. Don't ask me about the details because I find it very fascinating, but I'm not an engineer. But so far, no country was capable of replicating the technology that is found in an American aircraft carrier.
And by blue, you mean deep sea.
Precisely. They can operate globally.
Right. And so, I think one of the things we've learned, and correct me if I'm wrong, aircraft carriers, to me, this conversation could go so many places. I do want to continue our tour and the Belt and Road Initiative. Maybe we should dig down on that. But aircraft carriers, to me, seem to be a relic of the past.
How so?
Drone wars. I think you've seen that in Ukraine. When we were in Taiwan, we spoke to the people responsible for the defense of the island, and they were telling us they've shifted their military capacity to be entirely drone based. It seems to me to be a relic because the idea that you would have this hulking behemoth in water that sends planes, it would be just subject to just high-end asymmetric warfare digitally. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've seen the low end in Ukraine. I think we'd see the high end with China. It just seems to me to have significant vulnerabilities and expenses that don't come with other emergent technologies.
I think that's a good point. And there's a great article by Brent Williams titled "This is Not Your Grandfather's War," where he makes precisely that argument. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, in many respects, drone warfare is a game changer. I think that is correct. But nonetheless, I would still argue that who has air superiority still matters. And if you look at Ukraine, I think it's a good example here.
Yeah.
But the Ukrainians, one of the first things that they were asking for, which they didn't get at the beginning of the war, was that somebody should implement a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And the second thing, to this very direct, and that they're constantly begging for, is not so much drones and tanks, it's airplanes. So because they do understand that the tools Russia is using to attack their energy and critical infrastructure, that if you would have air superiority, you could at least diminish the destruction that Russia is causing. So you're correct, the end of the aircraft carrier might be upon us, but I don't think we're yet fully there. I mean, one of the reasons why, which is, of course, I'm stretching the argument here a little bit, but one of the reasons why Taiwan is crucial for the United States, apart from semiconductor production, all these other things, is of course because it's basically an aircraft carrier right in front of China, right? An unsinkable, unmovable aircraft carrier. And I think that's one of the reasons. The same is, by the way, true when you look at the Middle East. There is, of course, apart from, we can call it historical and ideological reasons, but there is an interest. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, but of course also Israel, because these are then, again, unsinkable bases, if you want, for potential military intervention.
Okay, let's continue with our tour, if that's okay. So you mentioned a little bit of Taiwan. Talk to me about Japan and South Korea.
Well, I think the big question about Japan and South Korea, again, a problem very similar to the ones we have in Europe.
The economy?
The economy and demographics. Demographics.
Declining birth rate.
Because if you look at, South Korea, I think currently is worldwide leading in the lowest low fertility rate. So, without being a cynic here, but of course, defending South Korea against North Korea, or generally defending a country, you still need the people there. And I think the same is true in Japan, that the outlook of these countries of more or less disappearing from the face of the earth is a very, very real one. And I think this is an entirely underestimated and underappreciated problem currently in global conflict, not just from the perspective of that you run out of the quantity, or as Stalin would say, that quantity is a quality all of its own. But of course, it's also a cultural issue in the sense, and this is sometimes, I think, for many people an uncomfortable topic, but I think it's a topic that we have to address, is that if you are a couple and you have one child, the perspective of losing that child in a war is going to hit you differently than if you're a parent and you have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 children, and there is the chance that some of them are going to die in a war. I know that sounds very, very harsh, but it is a reality. I mean, even and I'm not saying that the value of a child goes down if you have more of them, but it is different. And this, again, I know this is a dicey topic, but of course we do have some evidence for this. If you look at interviews that have been conducted in Afghanistan, in the Gaza Strip with mothers, right? And they asked them, I said, so what future do you see for your children? And at least we know it definitely in the Gaza Strip, but where mothers say, well, one of the greatest honor for them would be if one of their son would die as a martyr against Israel. And I think you would not say that if you only have one child. I think my Arabic is very bad, but there was this one woman in the early 2000s who was nicknamed the mother of struggle, right? And I mean, of course, I think 4 of her sons died as suicide bombers. I mean, if it would be cynically, we could say, well, struggle is the only thing she's going to be a mother of at the end of the day. But apparently, this is indeed viewed differently. And that's one of the reasons why, again, if you look at a country like Germany, if you look at their demographic setup, the likelihood of Germany going to war over eastern Ukraine, like even if Ukraine would be a NATO member, which they're not, and I don't think they will be, it's just not going to happen, right? You would have a revolt before that is going to happen. And I think that is a reality we have to take into account. There is an interesting cognitive dissonance, I would say, almost on part of every participant currently in geopolitics, that the minds are very often stuck in, let's say, a late 19th, early 20th century that completely ignores some of the structural conditions we found now in the 21st century. I mean, you could, by the way, make the same argument about Russia and Ukraine per se. It's completely absurd. If you take, for example, the Germans before World War II, one argument, and whether we might disagree with it, but one argument that they made was Germany needs to expand because Germany is going to get too small for the Germans, right? They would Volk ohne Raum. Yeah, exactly. Lebensraum, exactly. Yeah. And right, nobody has to defend that argument, but at least at that time in the 1920s and 30s, if you look at, even though they were already declining then, but if you look at the birth rates at that time, you could make the case that, okay, maybe more land might be needed in the future. But if you look at the demographics of Russia at the moment, so even if Putin should be successful and his dream of reestablishing, hypothetically, the Soviet Union or a Soviet Union-like Russian Federation would succeed, he doesn't have the Russian to populate these areas. Because if on the current trajectory, by the mid of this century, it is quite likely that Yemen will have more inhabitants than there are Russians in Russia. So it's this mindset that, oh, we fight a war, to get this territory or to unify the nation, whatever it is. But the actual thing that makes a nation, its people, is in steep decline. I mean, Putin has now declared, I think, 2024, the year of the family. So they are somewhat aware of this. But my counter-argument would be, well, fighting a war is probably not the best way to fulfill the year of the family.
It's an eminently reasonable position. Okay, continuing our tour, if I may, please. What's up with Canada?
What would you like to hear about Canada?
Trudeau, liberalism, the economy, the relationship with the United States, immigration.
Well, I think Canada is an interesting case study, and I think we can use it again a little bit as a starting point to then take a broader view of things that are going on. Okay. What's interesting in Canada is, and this is something, Peter, that you have written very eloquently about them, no more than I do. So
we have to have him on again. Great guest. Keep going, Ralph.
I'm going to probe you. I'm going to probe you on this a little bit as well.
Not physically, I hope.
No. We'll do that after the McDonald's dinner. So
no, thank you.
We'll get into this a little bit later. But if you look at what's going on in Canada, there is this odd perception, I think, all over the West, that authoritarian measures can only come from one side of the political aisle, right? You hear this. We're currently in Hungary, right? And the Viktor Orban is the big fear of everybody. And you hear now we recently had elections in Austria, right, where the right had significant gains. We have now the upcoming elections in the United States with the fears that Donald Trump. I think Kamala Harris recently said that he's a fascist, which just tells me that she doesn't really know what a fascist is. Yeah. But we can go into this as well if we want to. Yeah. But the idea is always that kind of these dictatorial tendencies can only come from the right. And when you see them happening on the left, it gets almost ignored. And I think there were, if we dig a little deeper into the reign, if you want, of Justin Trudeau, I mean, there were many elements happening, many things going on in Canada that I think were not entirely in line with at least the textbook definition of a liberal democracy, right? Whether it was the treating of the truckers, whether it was, kind of the idea that the freezing of basically bank accounts if you donated to a quote unquote wrong cause. Something we, by the way, just to make it a little broader, you see this currently happening in the United Kingdom. I mean, what's currently going on in the UK?
Oh, the censorship.
Precisely. Censorship, but also arresting people for
praying,
for posting things on social media, things that I don't necessarily agree with. But it's a matter of priority. And what you see, and this brings back to my point, is that you have, when bad things happen, like you had in the UK, and they come from a specific part of society, the government or state is willing to turn a blind eye. But when it comes from another side, they don't. For example, I mean, many people is a horrible phrase, reliable sources, I think that's a better phrase, have reported, for example, on grooming gangs in the UK, right? The really horrible things happened to thousands of girls there. But the perpetrators came from, for lack of a better term, a protected group. So both the police, the government, they all were turning a blind eye. Right. Now, but if somebody on the right then goes out and says, fair enough, atrocious things, about, for example, these things. Like somebody like Tommy Robinson, with whom I have my issues, but he is right in some areas. Then the government, then the state is clamping down with full force on you. And we see, I think, the same happening in Canada as well, right? We are somewhat blind when bad things happen from a specific area. I'll give you one last example. In the United States, after October 7th last year, right, and the war breaking out between Hamas and Israel, you had a lot of these revolutions, the wrong term, riots, demonstrations on university campuses. And what is happening is that administrators didn't really know what to do, because they had established rules how you can demonstrate on campus. But when these groups overstepped, they had a really hard time enforcing those rules, because they came from part of their campus community, from society, that they felt they cannot be critical of, that they felt they cannot enforce the rules. And we saw it now, like, quietly. Now, even those who have overstepped those rules and were supposed to be expelled from the universities, their expellation, if that is an English word, their being expelled has been revoked. Now, let's try a thought experiment and say that the same protesters were white supremacists or neo-Nazis.
Yeah.
If they would have overstepped those rules and would have been expelled, there would not have been a quiet movement to get them back on campus. Because and again, to be very clear, I'm not defending here white supremacists. But what I'm saying is, if I'm a white supremacist and I say death to the Jews, I should justifiably so be expelled from a university for good. If I'm a supposedly a left-wing pro-Palestinian protester and I say death to the Jews, then the university has a very hard time expelling me in the first place. And even if they do so, most likely me being expelled is going to be revoked. Because we have this kind of uncomfortable feeling when we enforce rules when it comes to certain groups. And that's going to be, I'm sorry, this is a long answer and I want to
No, it's fine.
But this is a major issue that you see currently happening when it comes to the rightward shift in Europe, is because there is, sometimes it's exaggerated, but sometimes it's true. There is a sense, a feeling among the population, from Germany to Spain to the UK, not so much, I would say, in the US, but definitely in continental Europe and Great Britain, that the rules that exist are unequally enforced on one part of society compared to another part of society. So the claim that is being made about two-tier care in the UK, it's hyperbolic, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong.
So that reminds me of Marcuse's, liberating tolerance means intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so we got Canada. The United States is huge. You want to touch on our tour for the U.S.?
I would love to.
Okay, because we got obviously our election is upcoming. Talk to me.
I mean, I stick to this, and I've been saying this for 20 years, and I'll say it for the next 20 years. I would never bet against the United States. For the very simple reason, I still believe, and again, I do the same thing that I was accusing others before. I look towards the past and extrapolate towards the future. So I still have this conviction that the kind of the self-cleaning or the forces of being able to renew itself in the United States are still strong. And this has always been my interpretation of Donald Trump. Again, there are many things about Trump that I disagree with. His behavior. There's a lot, and the media has talked about this for years, so I don't think we have to go through this here. But if you look at it from a different perspective, now you have a political party system in the United States of two parties. And if you go back to 2016, originally the plan, that sounds like a conspiracy, but the expectation was you're gonna have one candidate from the House of Clinton, if you want, versus one candidate from the House of Bush.
Yes.
So which is, it's less a two-party system than a dual monarchy system, if you want. So you have kind of two competing houses. It's like in Dune, right? You have two competing houses against each other. And then you have this
whose House Atreides, that's what we need to know, and whose House Harkonnen.
Precisely. Right? And then you have this kind of unguided rocket, this unguided missile appear in the form of Donald Trump, who then, for a multiplicity of reasons, wins the election in 2016. What I always found so interesting in that this happened, that in my opinion, until the breakout of COVID, I think especially the first 3 years of his presidency were, in my opinion, very good years for the United States. I think they were pretty good years for the world. And we can talk about this in greater detail. I think that Donald Trump, even though he's not necessarily capable of formulating his instincts and ideas. I think he very often has a pretty good gut feeling. And if he has the right people to execute his gut feelings, the results can be very promising and good. I think we saw this in the Middle East, for example. I mean, the Abraham Accords, any other president would have gotten a Nobel Peace Prize for the Abraham Accords. But I digress. I just wanted to make another point, which is that in many ways, the election of Trump was actually a reaffirmation of democracy, because it showed that you can have a system where the appearance is, justifiably so, that you have two parties that are so entrenched that change is not possible. And then you have a figure like Trump coming up and showing that change is possible. Now, the argument about Trump is that whatever he is, you need to be insane to do that. I mean, this is kind of my defense of the insanity or the kind of the...
I mean, like the whole meeting with North Korea, well,
that's already when he's in office. But even to take on the system, I mean, I remember you do as well in 2016 when he came down that escalator and had his Mexico speak and immigration. Everybody mocked him pretty much until 2 days before the election. And in fact, we have it all on tape, right? Barack Obama said, Donald Trump will not be the next president, Fareed Zakaria. Everybody was absolutely sure he's not going to win the election. But at the end, he did win the election, which I think showed for many people in the United States, number one, that change is possible. And number two, what he's accomplishing, and I think this is a much bigger story, it should be a much bigger story, that he's activating people who until very recently would have never even thought about participating in an election. That's a good thing. I think overall, that's a good thing, that people who thought, I cannot participate in the system, right? Because the system has forgotten me, it ignores me, that they actually go back to the voting booth, that they go back to participate in politics. I think a lot of the stuff that's currently going on in the United States on the long run is actually potentially healthy for the political system. Again, it's a very optimistic take, but we should not underestimate both the American people, but also the resilience of the American system.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm super bullish on the United States long term. I'm bearish on the immediate short term. It depends on the election and other factors. Okay, so let's, a few things are lingering. I'm much more cynical about the One Belt, One Road policy than you are, so we should probably talk about that. But I don't think we've kind of hit the rest of the world. I just read this morning that Turkey bombed places in Kurdistan. That's probably not politically correct, or maybe it is politically correct to say Kurdistan. And the just meeting with someone about the perennial issue of Turkey going into the EU. Let's talk about Turkey.
Okay, what would you like to talk about? But is Turkey ever going to become a member of the European Union?
Well, that's one. Oh, really? I wasn't going to expect.
Never going to happen.
That's one question. I guess, what do you view as Turkey's role in the tensions with the United States, the tensions in NATO? How do you view Turkey's role moving forward, given the past tensions?
Oh, that's a great question, and because it allows, I think, to dive really into the stuff that's interesting also for your viewers, which is that history has a long shadow, and that is especially true for countries that are in regions where they not necessarily share a lot with their neighbors. We are currently in Hungary. The Hungarians are actually very similar in this. And if you talk to Hungarian diplomats and if you talk to Hungarian politicians, they very often speak very highly of Turkey. And the reason for this is because, well, first of all, significant parts of Hungary have been under Ottoman occupation for a significant chunk of the history. But the Hungarians are in a very similar position as the Turks are in their region of the world. Right? The Hungarians they are neither Romanic nor Germanic nor Slavic. Right? They're an island among people that are linguistically and culturally not entirely, but significantly different from them. I mean, we Austrians shared a state with them for a very long time, so we know what we're talking about, to put it this way. And Turkey is in a similar position, right? They are not Arabs. They are not. They're not European. They're not Greek. So to speak.
Persians.
They are not Persians, exactly. So they have a similar position, which on the one hand, of course, makes you lonely. But on the other hand, of course, it gives you a significant amount of freedom in the way you conduct your foreign policy, because they have no, let's call it, historically grown or necessary allegiances to anybody in the regions except themselves. I mean, this has been, without getting too far back in history, but this has been one of the causes of World War I, right? It has been that the cultural, linguistic ties between Austria and Germany have been so strong, right? That it was very difficult to conduct a policy of balancing power in Europe, because the alliances were no longer just defined by national interest, they were also defined, let's say, by cultural commitments. And this is, of course, a problem that currently Turkey doesn't really have. And you see this, right? If you look at Turkish foreign policy, the way towards Israel, for example, they have been pro-Israel, anti-Israel. They do kind of whatever they think in their national interest. And the other important point when it comes to Turkey is, of course, and I think that's something we not necessarily have to approve of, but I think it's something that we have to understand, that of course they see themselves as a potential hegemonic power in the region, because this is something that historically was a role that they played, and it's a role that they historically would like to play
Where we're sitting
again.
right now.
Exactly. And this, by the way, the same is true, I would argue, in Iran, right? I mean, the Iranians
That terrifies me.
Yeah, they don't just see themselves as, I would even argue that the Iranian kind of one of the motivating forces of Iranian policy is not so much a religious component. I think that has been added into it, but of course also the historical Iranian consciousness, right? That Persia has been a hegemonic power in that region, and they have a certain entitlement to play a key role in the future of that region. I mean, we must not forget that hegemony might be, and this is an area where you come from, Peter, right? That might be a dirty word in our faculty lounges in Western universities. It's not a dirty word in Turkey. It's not a dirty word in Iran. It's not a dirty word in Egypt. It's not a dirty word in China, right? I mean, for them, it's not a dirty word in India or Russia. For them, the idea that a state has to aspire to be to have a last word or to be a veto power in its vicinity, in the region where it is. Again, up until, I would argue, the 1960s, and when you had this left-wing shift towards post-colonialism and all these ideas in the West, that was complete obvious foreign policy. It's also useful foreign policy, right? What's the best way to protect yourself? Well, dominate your neighbors, either peacefully or not.
Yeah, the irony there is, of course, they were ideologically colonized by Islam.
Yes. And that does play a role in it. I think that's true. But even there, I think if you take a closer look,
The Sunni-Shia split, is that where you're going to go?
not necessarily. There is. Let's put it this way: Turkey has, in addition to the religious component, Turkey has a fallback identity, which is Turkish identity, Ottoman identity. I think Iran has potential. If there is a revolution in Iran tomorrow, they topple the mullahs, the Shah returns, right? I think turning Iran into, or shifting Iran from a religiously defined state into a, let's say, nationalistically defined state, I don't think that it's not going to be easy, but that is possible. The Arab world has it harder because the Arab world, if you look at the historical development, has been tribal and then religious. There never has been, let's say, a national phase in between. Like there never has been an Arab state that was primarily, based on a national identity. Religion was always a key factor here. And again, this is not their fault. This is just how, fortunately or unfortunately, history has developed. And the other element, just real quick about this, is, which is also very often forgotten outside of the region, if you talk to somebody in Iran or in Turkey, how they view the Arabs, right? I mean, you can grasp very quickly that religious loyalty only takes them so far. I mean, he died a couple of years ago, but this is an anecdote that I always find it's cruel, but I think it shows you a little bit the attitude. Bernard Lewis, right? Probably one of I think still the preeminent historian of Islam in the West, and he once told this anecdote is that he was in Indonesia, and Indonesia is one of the largest Muslim countries in the world, and he had a conversation with somebody there, and asked about how's the relationship between Indonesia and the Arab world and all of this, and he said that his conversation partner said to him, well, the greatness of Allah is reflected in the fact that He revealed Himself to the world's most backward people, the Arabs. Like, then, this is, to be clear, that's not my position. That's an anecdote that Bernard Lewis has been telling. But I think this idea, again, which is a very Western idea, that here is the West, and then here is an alliance of all other states, cultures, and civilizations, and they all, are that close, and they all pull in the same direction.
That's the clash of civilizations.
Exactly. But even Huntington has more than just two civilizations, right? He says there's the West and there are all these other civilizations, and I think that is true. But there is lots of potential for conflict within the non-Western civilizations as well. And I think this is, once again, we return to the beginning of our conversation. This is, I think, where many of the admirers, if you want, or proponents of BRICS are a little bit blind to the fact that there are many things that divide the member states of BRICS, and they are much more fundamental than things that divide, for example, let's say France and Germany today, like it was different 150 years ago. To give you just one quick example, this was about a year ago, a little less than a year, the Chinese Ministry for Commodities, for Natural Resources, they issued a directive that all former Chinese cities in Russia, right, that they have to be renamed in official Chinese documents by their Chinese names.
Oh, interesting.
So there is a clear sense, at least in some circles within the Chinese elite, that looks at parts of the territory that was lost to Russia in the 19th century, what they believe is something that actually should at some point return to China. Now that's, I would argue, territorial disputes are not something that bode well for the future relations of states. And the Russians know this. The Chinese know it. The Indians know it. So these issues are there, and they will not disappear just because once a year there's a BRICS meeting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a conversation with an expert about this over drinks, and he was telling me, I was asking him about the war in Ukraine, and he said what his predictions were, and he said he predicted that Russia will be a vassal state of China. You agree?
A vassal state is a strong term, but I think as where the journey is currently going, I think it is a fair assessment. And this adds another wrinkle to the conversation, a topic that I know, again, is uncomfortable. But as I said before, we have this cognitive dissonance in the West of the mind is stuck in the 19th century, but reality is in the 21st century. But that's also true in Russia. Right? If you would ask the Russian leadership what they think of the Chinese, they still look at the Chinese in the way they looked at them in 1842. But as you correctly point out, the power relationship is completely inverse now.
Interesting.
It's no longer the Russians who call the shots.
I think we do that in our personal relationships too.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm still thinking of the One Belt, One Road. But before we go back to that, what spots in the world have I missed? That's my first question. And then I have another question about non-Western versus Western conflict management strategies like liberalism and illiberalism. But so we have three things. But before we get to those things, what areas of the world have we missed on our tour?
Well, we haven't. We started out with it, but we haven't touched on Africa a lot.
We started out Nigeria.
For obvious reasons. But I think that's going to be one of the biggest issues in the years to come. Nigeria.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't Iran undergoing terrible budget deficits and a terrible economy right now? And they're trying to. Of course, they're blaming it on the West. I was talking about my friend Faisal Al-Mutar from Ideas Beyond Borders beyond this. Okay, so we have what's going on with the rest of Africa?
Well, I think the big question there is demographics, and demographic in the sense of at the end of the day, you have two choices. Either you develop, and that means that the people, the surplus of people they can stay in the country, or you hinder the development, or you don't have economic development, and then people have to leave. Yeah. Currently, the world is trying the second option. Right, there is not the necessary amount of economic development in Africa that would be necessary for people to stay there. To be clear, right? I mean, fertility is going down there as well. Birth rates are dropping there as well. But that's still a long wave. So at the moment, as of speaking right now, right, the population there is still growing. Now, what makes this interesting, I think, is that in many ways, what hinders economic development in Africa are ideological positions taken by the West. To give you one quick example, there's an extremely strong correlation between human rights violations, between modern forms of slavery, between forced marriages, all things that are entirely negative in its impact, and the lack of access to electricity. And one of the reasons why significant parts of sub-Saharan Africa don't have access to electricity is because Western governments, including the World Bank and Western-dominated institutions, have, let's say, drunken so strongly from the renewables and environmental Kool-Aid that they have hampered or openly obstructed the possibility to get those countries to cheap, affordable, and reliable energy, thereby condemning them to live under worse conditions. But it's not just the energy sector. I mean, one of the things that I found absolutely astounding and that should be talked about much more is you had the possibility to use genetically modified rice, right?
That's golden rice. I remember that. Yeah, that was a while ago.
That would address, for example, vitamin A deficiency. So that really would have made a huge positive impact on people living in that area.
So those concerns were not practical or grounded in facts and evidence. They were ideological concerns that were imported upon, right?
Because Greenpeace basically said, everything that is GMO, that is genetically modified, is bad. And even if it can save children's lives, well, pretty much the argument was we don't care. And there is more to this. I mean, this is an older story from the 70s and 80s. DDT, right? Kind of, which was a way to eradicate the mosquitoes carrying the malaria virus.
Or just mosquitoes, period.
Mosquitoes, period, correct. And there was to this very day that the negative impact of it on human beings was never fully proved compared to the impact that malaria has. But there was...
Well, it also made and again, I'm not a biologist, but it also made mosquitoes resistant to DDT. Because it didn't kill all the mosquitoes. And then you kind of bred, the argument was that you're breeding some extra natural, if you will, or you're breeding some kind of uber mosquitoes.
Sure, but that would be like saying we ban penicillin or antibiotics because you maybe at some point get a strain that is resistant or that adapts to it.
Right, I'm not saying it's a good argument, but it's the kind of the Frankenstein argument.
And I think that's a fair argument, but we do have the numbers because we basically ran a natural experiment where we had these countries that were using DDT, like we saw the numbers of malaria cases drop, and then when they banned DDT, we saw them skyrocket again.
Right.
But the thing is always things move over time. So I'm not saying that DDT was like the one solution, but it would have been part of the solution. And then as we move forward, right, you would have found ways to replace it with maybe something that is both environmentally and also from a health perspective would have been better. Just like we do it in the West, right? We start out with coal power plants, then we move to gas, and then we hopefully move to nuclear. But you have to start at the cheapest and most reliable form.
See, that's interesting. Bill Gates talks about this idea of leapfrogging technologies, and so you can just move from coal to nuclear. But even then, there are ideological forces at play that, oddly enough, people who are worried about global climate change, anthropogenic warming, they don't want nuclear power. Victor Stenger said to me a while ago, he's a physicist, kind of a mentor to me, he said he thought it was an example of a deep-rooted superstition on the left.
I think it's more. I think there's more. There is one, I just read it today before our conversation. It was pure coincidence. It must have been a strike of fate. These days, for obvious reasons, everybody likes to undust Francis Fukuyama's The End of History.
Yeah,
right?
we were just talking about him on the show. Yeah.
And I have to make the claim that I think the book is more often mentioned than it is actually being read. And there's one paragraph, it's just because I saw it today, so this is pure coincidence, but I think it fits so nicely with what you just said. On page 330, so towards the end, when he's no longer talking about the end of history, but more about the last man, right? This Nietzschean idea.
Yes.
He has this great paragraph where he says, well, there could be a situation where if society has achieved many just causes, he says that there is the possibility that instead of celebrating these just causes, we start to struggle against just causes for the sake of struggle. And I think that explains a lot. I think we see this
really interesting.
Not with everyone, but if you take the environmental movement in its early days, I'll give you one example. Jared Diamond, right? He wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel, fantastic
We just
books.
talked about that book yesterday on the show.
It's a great book, right? But he also made this argument, he wrote this essay that agriculture was like the worst mistake in human history. And that's an odd argument. Right? For most of human history, getting food was an almost unsurmountable challenge. It was really, really difficult. And we solved that problem. And instead of celebrating it, we have now this trend to say that we kind of struggle against modern agriculture. You see this in Europe, you see this in other places as well. Or to give you another example, somebody who was wrong on almost everything, but he still moved from talk show to talk show, Paul Ehrlich, right, the population bomb guy.
Yeah.
He made this argument, that's a direct quote, because remember, he said, cheap and abundant energy for humanity would be like giving an idiot child a machine gun. And these ideas matter, right? And going back to what you just said,
I wrote about Ehrlich in my last book.
Yeah.
It always amazes me that the people who are consistently wrong, it doesn't affect their career at all.
Well, I think they're lucky in the sense if you tap into as Hegel would say, if you tap into the zeitgeist of a society, it really doesn't matter so much what you say, as long as you get the sentiment, the emotions right. I mean, you saw this, and I don't want to mention her too often because she gets too much publicity anyways, but you see this with Greta Thunberg.
I knew you were going to say that, yeah.
But it's a good example.
Yeah.
Right? This is, if you find that, whether by coincidence or by planning, but if you see where the a significant part of the zeitgeist of the emotion is, right? I think you can attach yourself to that again, whether by calculation or by sheer coincidence, and it has this effect. And people, if you can satisfy an emotional need, I think you're just so much less likely to look at the underlying facts if you want. And by the way, to be clear, I'm the same. I mean, this is what Jonathan Haidt always says. Kind of when we look at evidence that contradicts our established beliefs, we don't just throw our existing beliefs out of the window and say, oh, well, some new evidence, I no longer believe what I believed. And we look at it, and the same first thing is we say, do I have to believe this? Can I, or is there a way around this?
So can I ask you a completely curveball question?
Sure.
This is probably the most American question anybody has ever asked you in your whole life. Why don't countries just adopt our constitution?
That's a. What do you mean? What do you mean? Why don't they just adopt your constitution?
Well, any country can adopt our constitution.
Well,
I mean, why wouldn't, I don't know, Nepal? I mean, I don't know. Pick a country of your choice. We're doing a tour. Why don't they just adopt our form of government, adopt our constitution?
I think the main reason
you're throwing because it's an idiotic question.
No, it's a great.
I had something in the back of my mind saying, "Don't ask him. Don't ask him. It's too stupid of a question."
No, it's a great question. I think it's a fantastic question because the argument could be made to say, "Look how the system worked out in the United States. Why wouldn't anybody else want that?"
That's
right?
my thinking.
And I think that's a very good argument. And the problem with it is, and this goes back to, I think that goes beyond almost the American experiment. It goes very much back to the beginning of the Enlightenment, right? Was this idea that if the motion of the planets can be explained and understood, then the motions of societies, if you will, must be understandable in the same way. So hypothetically, there should be a blueprint for a perfect is maybe that's too Rousseauan, but for a well-functioning society, right? Where all the cogs are reaching into each other and the machine is just running. And I think that is a sound argument. The problem, I think, is that in the American experience, and I think that all partially derives from the European experiment, is that we have forgotten, but that might be also kind of a witness to how strong certain cultural values are, that we no longer recognize them as cultural values. That the very conditions, the very belief systems that make the American Constitution possible simply do not exist to the same extent in other parts of the world. To give you one very quick example, and we can go into greater detail why I think that this developed, or why people that are much smarter than me think that this developed, is that we understand the idea of individuality in a way that if I'm a citizen of a country, the institutions of that country are supposed to treat everybody equally, as far as, it's never perfect, but as far as possible, right? That if I apply for a passport and you apply for a passport, and the civil servant who makes the passports happens to be John, Bogosian, that he will still take me first if I applied before you, even though he's related to you, right? We would simply assume that.
Right.
If you go into countries that are still, let's say, more family-based, kind of where loyalty to the community, to the family, is more important than individual, exactly, tribalism, then that's simply not going to happen, right? They're going to say, sure, Ralph, you applied first, but you must understand, Peter is my brother, so obviously he comes first. And that is, by the way, I would immediately add, that struggle is something that was realized not just in the United States and Europe. If you look at Chinese, this is the fascinating part about the Chinese. I mean, Chinese history is basically a constant struggle of the state against the family. Like if you look at the stories of how the first modern Chinese states developed, pretty much what they were trying to do desperately was to break out the individual from the family and then ideally turn them into neutral civil servants. We talked about Turkey. Look at the history of the Ottomans with their policy they had, right, where they took children from Christian lands, and they didn't do it because they were cruel. They did it because they were hoping that if they staffed their civil service with people that have no family relation to somebody else, then they will only be loyal to the state. So the natural state of human affairs, I would argue, is one of very, very strong loyalty to the family, to the tribe. And it was only gradually that we replaced this with an individualistic, or that we built institutions that allowed an individualistic society. That's the key. So when you take the US Constitution and you don't have these preconditions of an more or less individualistic society, or the kind of individuality as it came out of Christianity due to what and I come to this in a second because I think it's an important point, what the Catholic Church did, then this is very difficult. We tend to forget this, particularly in the West. What the Catholic Church did, I mean, it's quite fascinating. Nobody would think that the Catholics are feminists, but in the broader strike of history, they were, because they broke European tribes. There were tribes, and there were Saxons, Bavarians, like there were all these tribes. But then the Catholics came up. They did it partially for power reasons, but also partially for theological reasons. They came all of a sudden along and said, this whole first cousin marriage, this kind of intermarrying to keeping the tribe kind of poor, we're no longer going to do this. And even what they did, which I think was the absolute stroke of genius, they said, and by the way, the woman has a say in whom she wants to marry. I mean, think about Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. I mean, who is secretly marrying them? It's the priest. Against the established convention that the parents have to decide who's going to marry whom. So we broke the family, or we broke the tribe in Europe, which allowed then the emergence of a stronger individuality, which is the precondition for a constitution like the one the United States have.
Yeah, it reminds me of The Cage of Norms by Osamigo and Robinson, The Narrow Corridor, when it comes to marriage and family. And I'm also thinking about in Pakistan, the high rates of cousin marriage, and we'll bracket that. So I'm going to ask you one more super weird question, like just a total curveball question.
Again.
This one is a less American question. So you've talked about how birth rates in Europe have decreased and people are deeply concerned about the consequences of that. People are deeply concerned about the changing demographic, particularly with regard to a radical influx of Muslims, most of whom are decent, law-abiding people, but there is a non-trivial minority of people who are hell-bent on overthrowing the civilization, erecting parallel court structures, and et cetera, terrorism, et cetera. So this is my weird question to you. I'm a little hesitant to ask you this because it's a really curveball question. I understand that Mexico is not in the European Union, but why not just admit some Central American country to the EU, and they don't have to worry about Islamic immigration, and they can fill their labor shortage and their decreasing population demographic?
Well, I think the idea is interesting. I would argue that actually there are two things to this.
Okay.
One is...
You just handled that great. That was great. Keep going.
No. One is that, of course, the amount of immigration from Muslim countries that's happening at the moment, none of them is a member of the EU. So that's actually the kind of migration that Europe, or Western Europe particularly, is experiencing at the moment, is actually from non-EU countries. So hypothetically, the Mexican or the Latin American
be perfect.
Solution,
That's what. Be perfect. That's one of the things I was thinking about.
You'd be surprised. Many of the right-wing parties, or what the media would call the far-right parties in Europe, are precisely proposing what you just said.
You're kidding me. I thought it was a Peter Boghossian original right here today.
I don't think any idea is patented yet, so there's still a chance for that. But yes, because the argument that they're making goes exactly along the lines what you were saying, that they said the most important element is cultural compatibility.
Right. They're Christians.
They're Christians. I still think that there are some differences, but
of course,
the assimilation of somebody from Latin America is most likely significantly easier than the assimilation of somebody from Somalia. And I think even
and the type of immigrants they're going to get are very different.
Oh, that's true. Yeah,
very, very different in their aspirations, etc. So, I mean, so this is shocking to me that this has actually been proposed.
The reason for this is, I believe that, and there I have to blame the media, if you forgive me doing that, is that the desire is, and in some cases it's justified, but there is such a strong desire to paint the right in a very specific way that they willfully ignore the nuances. And the nuances are that just like in the United States, you have somebody like Nick Fuentes, and where you have the real kind of hardcore neo-Nazi, blood and soul types. They exist, and they also exist in Europe, no doubt about this. But most of the politically relevant, so quote unquote far-right parties, right? They do make the distinction between what they call, Western migration within the cultural sphere of Western civilization.
Tommy Robinson, you mentioned him before.
Tommy Robinson, for example. But even it's completely absurd when we have this conversation. For example, this is why I don't like the term migration, because I think this is one of the things we don't also. It's like saying, I'm a doctor. I'm not a real doctor. I'm a political scientist. So if somebody has a heart attack on a plane, I can't help anybody. But if assume I'm a real doctor and I ask you, so Peter, I'm interested in your health. What do you eat? And then your answer is,
it's one of my favorite subjects.
Right? But imagine that your answer is food.
Right.
Then if I'm a good doctor, I will say, well, you have to give me more details. And I think the same is true about migration. If you want to, it's not just that you say migration per se. Okay, who are the people that are coming? What is their demographic makeup?
Right.
What's the average age? Is it more men? Is it more women? Right. So then it gets then you can come closer to an actual conversation because then you know what you're talking about. It's like with the doctor. If you say, I have a stomach ache and my answer to what I'm eating and I just say food, the doctor will not be able to help me. If I say I ate, I don't know, fish that was 3 weeks past its expiration date, then he has something to work with. And the same is true in the migration debate.
So you think you should have an adjective there, like Islamic immigration, Mexican immigration, Polish plumber immigration?
To be honest, yes. Because the disconnects here is that when the word, both by the media and to the discourse, the word migration is used, and you ask Europeans, say, you have polls in France, in the UK, and say, 60% say there should be less migration. They don't talk about you and me. Like the person is being asked, they could then say, oh, so you're against an Austrian or an American country. No, they have a specific picture that they connect to the term migration.
I never believed Brexit, by the way, was about Polish plumbers. I've said that from day one.
You're 100% right. And everybody you asked would give you exactly the same answer. And the same with in Germany, right? When they say, we want less migration, we want the new term that is coming up, they want remigration, bringing people back to their country of origin. They're not talking about the French chef, right? They're not talking about the Austrian comedian. Like this, everybody knows what they're talking about. So we're deliberately, kind of murking the waters of this conversation. But I'm not saying that there is. Again, this is a long answer, but I think it's an important one. There is a sense, and this is how also we started our conversation, that people are open to change. Societies in the United States, and we have always changed. But there's a difference between evolution and rapid transformation. So I give you one example. I guess I don't know how many Taliban are among your listeners, but they probably enjoy this. Up until the late 1970s, in Austria, a wife was not allowed to open a bank account or start working without permission of her husband. Now, right, one could say, okay, what's the difference between Austria in the 1970s and parts of Saudi Arabia today? And you would say, well, the difference is very small, actually, in some of these cases. But society then evolved beyond that, but it still remained Austria, right? It was a gradual evaluation of rather, values that were, I would say, in many ways hostile to women, to less of that, and now I would say it's almost non-existent. But that was an evolution that took place within that society. Now, what you have currently happening, if you all of a sudden have parts of Vienna, if you have parts of London, if you have part of Paris, who are no longer French, who are basically Algerian or Syrian or Pakistani, that's not an evolution. That's a massive transformation. And this is what makes people feel uncomfortable. This is not gradually seeing...
It's not an incrementalism.
Exactly. And it goes in the other direction, by the way, as well.
Okay, so let me ask you, because I've been thinking about this a lot. So we had Eric Kaufman on the show a couple of times, become a friend of mine. We had Matt Goodwin on the show a couple of times. He's coming back to Hungary, by the way. I just talked to him the other day. So he's going to come back. And something Eric Kaufman said, I just cannot get this out of my head, is that he did a thorough analysis. He's a political scientist. He's Canadian, lives in, lives in England. And I've said this on the show before, but I just think it's just so fascinating, is that there are consistently, and the data is overwhelming now, people who contribute to the Treasury and people who take away from the Treasury. People who consistently commit more crimes from certain group demographics, and people who consistently commit less crimes. And it's no surprise they're the same demographic. And when you look in Europe, when you look in Denmark, everywhere those statistics are allowed to be compiled, they are virtually identical. Yeah. And so let's talk about, and again, this is not my data, this is people who have analyzed the evidence. The people who commit the least crime and contribute to the Treasury the most universally are the Japanese. The people who commit the most crime and take away from the treasury the most universally are the Somalians from Somalia. What is the problem with having an immigration policy based upon that one metric? Who contributes to the treasury? Who takes from the treasury? And it can't be said that it's racist because the Japanese, I understand have their serious population problems. This is more of a heuristic or a way to think about this problem. What's the problem with saying, let's have an immigration policy that's data driven, and we're just going to take people who contribute to the treasury, and if you don't contribute to the treasury, or traditionally your people have committed a disproportionate number of crimes, we're just not going to let you in, like a pure wholesale.
Okay, seems reasonable. But I would begin my answer with, look at the way in which you asked the question.
Okay.
Right, you immediately went to, this is not me saying this is what the data shows.
Right.
Saying this is not racist. So you stated an objective fact, but immediately felt compelled to go in a defensive position.
Yeah, because I know someone's going to clip that out 5,000 times and be like, Boghossian's a Nazi, Boghossian's a conservative, Boghossian's neo-Nazi, Boghossian's neoconservative, like he's an alt-right maniac, like... So those,
even though what you say is factually absolutely correct.
Yeah, so those statements always have to be buttressed by something like that.
Yes, because the reason, and it's correct, because the underlying problem, I believe, and this is something I'm absolutely convinced, the reason why the argument, despite it being factually and objectively correct, why it is not having any force in the public discourse is because among the current elite, and I'm glad to also define the term elite because I don't just want to throw out the term that we don't agree, that we don't at least define a little bit, but among the current elite, both in academia, in culture, and in the current status quo political class, I think, and there's a pushback coming both from the left and the right in some areas. For them, the main purpose of migration policy is not to solve an economic problem, it is to atone for the sins of the past that the West supposedly has committed. So when you say that, for example, the immigrant from Somalia, the immigrant from the Middle East is getting more out of the system than they pay in, they might not tell you that, they might not say it, but in their mind, and I know what I'm doing is horrible, because basically I'm insinuating that I know what somebody is thinking, but I'm actually convinced of this. They say, okay, it is true that they get more out, but we have exploited them for decades. We were responsible for the
to kind of form a reparations.
It is. That's precisely the argument. This is how they think, which is also why we see in plenty of cases. You cannot in Germany at the moment, in Austria the same, and we have, by the way, the same rulings by the European Court of Justice, which is why it is so hard to implement the policies that you say, right? That you say, well, shouldn't we vet people for their potential or actual contribution to the economic system? But it's not working because the idea is for so many people in the policy-making space that this is in fact atonement for the sins of the past. You saw it just currently with the UK. It's completely absurd. The UK has, I think it was the Commonwealth Conference, and there are debates about the UK paying reparations for slavery. The UK was the country that spent most money in all of human history to abolish slavery. So, but this is I think you said it before, like this is a form of superstition. But that underlies this. And you cannot reason based on numbers with somebody who takes an almost religious, emotional side.
Yeah, Gad Saad calls it suicidal empathy.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it.
Okay, so then let me...
I think pathological altruism is also one of these terms.
Yeah. So then let me ask you this, to be blunt with you. Well, it's our fault. The whole thing is our fault.
Oh, absolutely.
Of course it's our fault. If you want to know who's at fault for it, look in the mirror. We can't close our... And I'm not just criticizing Europe. I mean, we can't even close our own border in the South.
Absolutely.
I'm trying not to bring the trans thing in it, but there's just so many parallels. Like, it's not happening. Okay, it's happening. It's a good thing it's happening. There's this trajectory, there'll never be someone, who rapes a trans woman in a woman's prison who rapes, and then we get it, and I'll put out a tweet sarcastically like, oh, this has to be fake news. We were sure this wouldn't happen. This has to be fake news. We were sure illegal immigrants wouldn't kill anybody, blow things up, the terrorists wouldn't come. I mean, it's so obvious. But I want to go back to a couple of things. It does seem like a kind of radical egalitarianism to me, to a certain extent, the immigration policy. But is an argument against making immigration policy or deciding immigration policy on, for example, who contributes to the treasury, Do you think someone would say that's a kind of collective punishment for all those people, or would that not even enter into their calculus?
I don't think it would be a form of collective punishment. On the contrary, I mean, you need to define some criteria. And I hear this very often in debates, both in Europe and in the United States, and we had this particularly in Europe after the refugee crisis of 2015, is you need some standards. Right? The idea that you simply can say, in the most intense case, borders are open, right? That if you say that asylum is a human right, then that's an argument I'm happy to have. Well, then you're hypothetically also saying that everybody of the millions of people that are currently displaced, and which is all tragic. Again, nobody makes light of this. But can a country, for example, Austria has 8 million inhabitants, so we're closer to 9. No, could we take in hypothetically 2 million refugees without the country breaking down? No, we couldn't. So then just to say, but it's a universal right, it's a human right, as you said before, there are certain realities on the ground that you have to take into account. And this is, again, the problem with very often with ideological ideas. It goes back to the famous Hegelian saying when he was confronted with somebody said, you do know, Friedrich, that reality does not align with your theories. And he said, how tragic for reality. Yeah. And I mean, that's a very German way to look at the world. But you mentioned Marcuse and the Frankfurt School before. Yeah. One of the big ironies, I think, of the aftermath of World War II is the Germans most certainly lost the war on the battlefields. But I'm not entirely sure if this kind of German thinking is not still very strong in Western universities.
What do you mean? What? Oh, the Frankfurt School.
The Frankfurt School, but even the once cherished values, I would say in the UK and the United States particularly, was pragmatism, right? In many ways, that was the dominant ideology. You looked at what is working, and then this was the basis from which you formulated policy and moved on. But now it seems that both in the US, in the UK, just as in continental Europe, right, that we are much more, which on the one hand makes things more interesting and exciting, but we seem to be much more ideological than we have been in the past.
Yeah, that's Helen Pluckrose wrote a wonderful piece, How French Intellectuals Ruin the West, in Ariel a while ago.
I'm also happy to blame the French.
Oh, yes. I love blaming the French for things. Okay, so as you look at the world situation globally, not a tour now, what do you see in the next 5 or 10 years in the short term? And I realize that it's probably an odd question to ask given the rapid transformation that many have predicted that we'll see with AI. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, but what do you see short term? Do you see a Chinese blockade or invasion of Taiwan? Do you or how much of that depends on who's elected president? There are so many variables. The world just seems so complicated now compared to when I was a kid. What do you see in the short term, 5 to 10 years?
You're right. There are so many moving parts, and it's on the one hand, it's a great business model to do the whole Peter Seihan thing, where we say we now will explain the entire world in 15 minutes. So listen to us, we know exactly what's happening. And if it doesn't happen, we just pretend that we never said it.
Right.
So that'd be one way to do it. I think it depends a little bit on. I honestly believe that some of the trends that we currently see, I'm not sure where they go. For example, Europe is a good example here in this. The conservative right is getting stronger, but I could not tell you at the moment. Will they actually at some point get into government and be capable and competent in governing?
Well, they're in Italy.
Exactly, right. That'd be a good example. I think the positive one. Or is there going to be such a kind of from current governments, such an attempt to keep them away from power by all means necessary, that there was this saying once about the revolutions of 1848, right? It's one of my favorite quotes. I said it was a turning point in history where history refused to turn, and this is something that potentially we also see in Western Europe, right? That this could be a turning point in history, but history simply refuses to turn, and things will go on until they no longer can. The problem is that in the Western mindset, which is very often true, that after every downturn comes an upswing. And it was seen almost as a law of nature, right? Up, down, up, down. But what if we are currently in a situation where the conditions are aligning in a way that there is no guarantee that another upswing is going to come, right? You mentioned demographics. We have the culture wars in Europe becoming more and more along religious lines. I mean, this is going on. That the parallel societies and the growing influence of Islam on daily politics can no longer be denied. I mean, we can go through all the stories of schools where teachers say, well, even non-Muslim teachers should wear headscarf because
Correct.
otherwise. So there's plenty of that to talk about. So the question is, on the long run, will we move from having societies into a condition where it's all going to be parallel societies, and all these parallel societies will be managed by an overarching, ever more powerful state that, however, is ever harder to finance. So this is the big problem, I think. I mean, this is somebody
that was perfectly encapsulated. That is exactly how I see the problem.
And I think it is. I mean, there's some people that I don't agree with him on everything, but Patrick Deneen wrote about this, about
Yes.
why liberalism failed.
Yeah,
and he
yeah.
does make the argument, which I think there's something to it, that in fact, the more liberal supposedly a society gets, the more powerful a state you need. I don't think that's true in all instances, but I think it's definitely true in a society that wants simultaneously to be multicultural and liberal. Because I would argue, and I'm curious to hear what you think about this, because I would argue that liberalism in itself is a form of culture. So if everybody's liberal, then you have a liberal culture. But you cannot simultaneously be a society that is entirely liberal, but is also multicultural. Because what is then the multicultural element? And I think this is what many on the left don't, and also on the right increasingly, I'm afraid, don't understand. That is, if you come into a country and your beliefs are, let's say, the kind of beliefs that they have, I'm just picking a provocative example here, that the Taliban have in Afghanistan. The idea is that as soon as you're exposed, this was the late Christopher Hitchens partially said, right? Once you're exposed to the seductiveness of Western society, you can no longer resist it. But it turns out that no, people can resist it because although they
are resisting
they
it.
are resisting it, because at the moment, what you said before, you kind of can have it both ways. You can get parts of the material benefits, but at the same time, the society that in large part, I would say, because of the dominant culture, made those material benefits possible, they no longer demand from the newcomers to integrate into that society.
Correct.
And the big problem here is, because we know, that sounds overly dramatic, but I think it's true. We no longer know what our culture actually is. What are you supposed to integrate into? And this is, for me, always the unanswered question from liberalism. It's an interesting principle as a theory, but what is the essence of being a liberal, right? People say, well, live and let live, and my liberty ends where somebody else's liberty starts. But that's not enough of a formula I believe you can structure your life around. A religion gives you, I think, much clearer guidelines of how to live your life. What are the things that you believe in? And the ultimate fact still is that as human beings, we are not entirely individualistic. We are groupish, right? The tribal instinct is still there. So what's the liberal tribe? I think there is a liberal tribe, but it doesn't admit that it is a tribe.
Do you think in liberalism you see the idea that, as it's played out and manifests particularly now, that certain things that are just not worth fighting for, that the referee doesn't need a mascot?
I think so, but I you said the referee doesn't need a mascot. I would say a little bit modern liberalism reminds me of it's like playing tennis with the nets down. Yeah. Right, and you might strike an ace, but the other side is saying, well, that's just a social construct. Right. So it's like there are certain. It has diverged in some areas, I think, from the reality of the human experience, and then it very often twists itself into pretzels. I mean, this is
and I want to piggyback on that. That's just a social construct. The problem is that this isn't a bunch of fringe people. We just Travis and I did an event at the Danube Institute the other night, and among the themes that emerged, someone asked about QAnon, and my response was that QAnon doesn't have organizational institutional power. The idea that, applied postmodernism, as I mentioned before, Helen Pluckrose talks about it, these ideas, this is just a social construct, these have been embedded in the fabric of our academic institution. We've taught an entire generation of people to believe this nonsense. And it's interesting to me, I would bet virtually, I have no data for this is speculation, but I would bet with odds this is true. The same people who believe in this idea that everything is a social construct would not be willing to fight if their country were invaded.
I think you're absolutely right. The problem, and that's at least for me always the best way to put it, I hope it makes sense, is that in a truly liberal society, or a contemporary liberal society, if you want, it is very hard to make an argument as to why the community can demand anything from the individual. I mean, this because we have, which in many ways is great, don't get me wrong. I mean, I don't want to throw all of this out of the window, but we have shifted it to that the individual has demands on the community. So I'm pretty sure if John F. Kennedy would still be alive today and talk about don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country,
about that,
they would call him a far-right extremist. I'm 100% sure of this. But the problem with this is it's not just in the government controlling a woman's body and all these talking points, but my absolute conviction, and this is I'm 100% convinced of this. I can't go into too much detail, but this is probably for another day. But I think the biggest boon for kind of civilization and development in the West was starting in the United Kingdom for different reasons, was the development of the gentleman. Right, this idea that the ability,
chivalry is dead, baby.
Yeah,
chivalry is now dead.
But the idea that you can channel, particularly in this case, male energy into constructive directions. And there's more to this. I just use this as I think the most maybe provocative example. And the idea was, I find this so fast. If you look at the history of the working class in the United States, in Europe in the 19th century, there was an aspiration by the working class, despite the tremendous misery they were living in, that they wanted to live up to the standards of the bourgeois class. So we have there's, I know these are anecdotes, but these are crucial anecdotes, right? There's a fantastic book about, it was written in the 1980s, a little bit earlier, about the German army as the school of the nation. And one of the most striking bits and pieces of this book is that when the kind of the aristocratic generals were confronted with the conscripted soldiers of the working class, they were blown away because they realized all of a sudden that these are people that made a tremendous effort to be like them, right? One thing is that one general or one officer said, like, he was befuddled because there was this guy from a factory and he could recite all the major works of Friedrich Schiller. And they said, why would a working class person do this? Because they understood. Again, despite the tremendous burdens and obstacles they had to go through to do this, because if you work a 10-hour shift and then go to the library and read Friedrich Schiller, that's pretty exhausting. But they did it because they accepted there was.
I'm laughing because I've read Schiller and I know how difficult it is.
Right?
Yeah.
Try reading him in German.
Yeah.
There was a societal standard that everybody was aspiring to live up to. Or my other, just a very quick one, because I think this is also such a good one. Look at the survival rates of the Titanic, right? Because this was the ultimate test, if you want, of chivalry. You can tell by looking at those survival rates, right, that women and children, most of the women and children survived, and then it goes gradually down. But the women and children first was not just a platitude. People lived up to the standard. Did everybody? No, probably not everybody. But there was a standard, and if you did not live up to it, right, you were the problem. Now we have created, I believe, increasingly a society where we have no standards. So people look for standards elsewhere. And if I'm a young Muslim migrant coming to Europe, if the society I'm migrating to does not give me clearly defined standards, that also, this is the important thing now, that also endow me with that give me respect, that make me well received, as you are if you can recitate Schiller, as you can if you behave as a gentleman. Right? If you don't get that, then what you are going to do is you look for some societal structure where you can find it, and they find it in Islam more than they find it in contemporary Western society.
Yeah, that's unbelievably soul crushing, but I think it's actually worse than that. Because it's not just that these models, these exemplars are not provided for people, but the traditional rules in which people live by and govern their lives, like self-sacrifice. That's why I was thinking when you mentioned the Titanic. We've now indoctrinated a generation of people to believe that they're entitled to things. And when you said, I was also thinking of John F. Kennedy's ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. We demean the idea of self-sacrifice. I think that leads to not only a crisis of meaning, but when you look at that from 30,000 feet above, what you see is people think there are things not worth fighting for. People think that the very values embedded in the society, which have enabled the society to thrive for so long. And those values, those are Western values that I would argue are open to the world, but the genesis of those values were on the left. But that doesn't cause you to be less optimistic because you said or does it? Because we're talking about like what's your 5 to 10 year prediction, and those are pretty ghoulish.
Well, the downside is there's I mean, this is a stretch, but there is this quote that supposedly Hermann Göring in World War II said that he knew that the war was lost when he saw British fighter jets over Berlin, right? Because they told him that the British now were capable of protecting their bombers even as far away as Berlin. And the reason why I'm saying this is because there is one element. If I see that, then I get seriously worried. And I agree with you. I see this increasingly, which is a civilization, I believe, or a society can always renew itself as long as it sees the problem as something that they can solve themselves, right? As you said, if you say, okay, something goes wrong, so what can I do to solve it? And this goes back to your point of the entitlement. If I say...
The Enlightenment.
The entitlement.
But the entitlement, okay.
If I went down a road where I say that actually the problems I have, the hardships I might be confronted with are none of my making.
They're due to systemic inequalities, racism,
right. They're
the
completely
system.
out of my control. Such a civilization, such a society can never recover because everybody is going to become lethargic, right? Because
it's impossible.
And you see, I mean, I know this.
It's a demotivator.
It is, and you see this in the. I know this is horrible, but you see it, of course, for example, in the Black community in the United States.
Yeah.
I think what young black men particularly, but with the African American community is indoctrinated with in the United States is entirely irresponsible. If you tell an entire generation that whatever you do, you have no chance. Like whatever you do, it doesn't make a difference. Okay, then why should you get up in the morning? Why should you go to school? I mean,
it's also extraordinarily divisive.
Of course, yeah. And we see this, I have to admit, also increasingly on parts of the right, which is, without switching topics too far, but this is also my problem with the resurgence in anti-Semitism. Because the reason why I believe that anti-Semitism is always like the canary in the coal mine for civilizational decline is because that's the easiest way out. Oh, things are bad. Why? Because of the Jews.
The Jews, right.
Like we had.
I've said that repeatedly, that it's the canary in the coal mine. And we see this dramatic increase in, and I again, I don't like anti-Semitism. I like the term Jew hatred. We see a dramatic increase in Jew hatred. And crimes against Jews.
And you can make the direct historical comparison. If you look at the late 18th, early 19th century, the more tolerant or the more inclusive a society became towards its Jewish members, the more prosperous society itself became. Not because there was some, the Jews were some secret sauce, but because it was a society that realized you solve your problems by addressing them and not just pointing out the group of people and say you're responsible for everything. Right. And this was the mindset that you had for all the negative things that also happened. But this was, I would argue, the kind of 18th, 19th century Western America, even more so, the mindset that is, again, all the problems were still there. But if you take the United States, again, for all the troubles it has, but it's an astounding history. You have a country that up until the 1860s had slavery. And the significant part of the population that literally were owned by other people. Now, if you look at where the United States stand today and look back at the history, I mean, this is, I will have to admit, I think it's still a success story. The kind of diversity the United States have, and they only had a horrible one, but they only had one civil war. The country was only, for so far at least, once at the risk of breaking up. And I think a lot of reasons why this was the case is because there has been, and I hope that, again, that this is not entirely over, there was the sense in the United States, right, that whatever hardship fate has dealt you, at the end of the day, it's yourself who has to pull it. And I know people will say, oh, Ralph, this is easy. No, it's easy for me to say because I was very lucky. But I would just then refer to people like Booker T. Washington, like Frederick Douglass, right? Who were themselves slaves. Right. But you said, this is horrible, and which it was. Nobody's going to deny this. But then they said, and now we're going to we got to do what we can to pull ourselves out of this. And they did. And I think this is a remarkable story that, again, we don't talk about. We've lost it.
Glenn Lowry writes about that in his book. He's talked about it. Mick Waters talked about it. But you're still optimistic on the United States in spite of it all.
Yes, I feel I have to.
Not because it's true, you mean?
Well, I mean, I believe that. Let me put it this way. Yeah. I think that humor and optimism are more contagious than doomerism and frustration. Yeah. And what I see increasingly, this is my theory, why particularly both the radical right and the radical left will lose in the future, is because they are entirely humorless. They're
interesting.
completely humorless. And the people who I think are still capable of cracking the occasional joke, like you and me and Konstantin Kissin and others, I find their worldview and their approach very compelling. So kind of it's a more like a rule of thumb. But I would say if the people that I find have, let's say, promising views are also the people who still can make me laugh, I'm somewhat optimistic about the future. I mean, this is for me also the thing about without getting too political, but this is also the thing about Donald Trump, which the idea that he's a Hitler-esque figure is completely absurd, right? He has many flaws, but this is not who he is.
He's not Adolf Hitler.
No, he's not. But you saw this when he did this McDonald's stunt, right? I mean, he actually enjoyed himself, right? There is a certain optimism to him. Ron DeSantis would have been my favorite candidate. So, and I'm not American, so I cannot tell the Americans whom to vote for. But there is he did bring a certain lightheartedness again, despite everything else, that I think is much needed. I think anger is always it's a bad advice, and humor is you convince more people with optimism, with being in good spirits than anything else, because we tend to forget that you and I and many others, we dabble in politics and commentary all day long. But many people, they work all day, they come home and they don't want to see anger, divisiveness, and this kind of thing. They just maybe for a change want to laugh, like want to hear a good joke. And I think at the moment, those people who can still make jokes tend to be on the side of the values that I also believe in. So that gives me some optimism.
Well, that's fantastic. That was a fantastic conversation. Ralph, where can people find you?
In Vienna and Budapest, the easiest way to find me online is I would suggest just Google my name. I'm very lucky that Ralph Schoellhammer is not a very common name. So you come across it very easily. I write for Brussels Signal, Unheard, and a couple of other publications. Every new reader, every new comment, everything is appreciated. If you comment on my stuff, I always try to get back and reply, unless it's insulting. This is my one policy.
Right.
Serious questions and positive comments get feedback. Insulting ones get muted. I think the mute button on social media is the greatest invention that was ever made.
That's perfect. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really appreciate it. All right. If you enjoy this interview, keep watching.